Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the event from access to sign language to access to safety. Let's sign up to sign language rights for deaf refugees. My name is Elham Yusufian. I work with the International Refugee Assistance Project as the Director of Disability Inclusion and Accessibility, and I'm going to be the event moderator today. Before we dive into our agenda, I do have a couple of requests and points about event accessibility. We are going to have sign language interpretation for this event. For most of the event, we're going to have both international sign and American Sign Language interpretation. But for some of the speakers, for technical reasons, we're just going to have American Sign Language interpretation. I kindly request everybody to keep their cameras off, except when they are speaking. That would make it easier for our deaf colleagues to see the interpreter in a bigger size, and they can follow the event easily. We also have live captioning for the event. I kindly request everybody who is speaking to keep a slow pace and speak as clearly as possible so we can have a good quality captioning for everyone to access. Throughout the event, we are going to have possibility to put your questions in the Q&A section. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature to raise them. And you can also put your points if you want in the chat, but the questions in the Q&A section would be much easier for us to follow. There would be opportunity to ask questions at the end of the event. All right. Now the event today. So the International Refugee Assistance Project has just launched our Disability Inclusion and Accessibility Program. And this is actually our first event on this topic. And I'm very happy that we are doing this event about access to sign language and highlighting requirements of deaf refugees. I'm very grateful to our co-sponsors of the event, the World Federation of the Deaf and also CBM Global Disability Inclusion. Thank you for your partnership. It's a great pleasure to work with you on this event. The purpose of the event today is to look into additional challenges that deaf refugees and displaced deaf people face throughout their journey, and is also to access safety, access the legal status on equal basis with others. We are doing this celebrating the International Day of Sign Language, which was this Monday, September 23, and also we are still in the week of the International Week of Deaf People. So we celebrate these occasions, and we really hope that this event would be an opportunity to learn more about deaf refugees, challenges they face, and identify concrete ways to support them. So be with us. We have a great list of speakers here who are going to look into the issue from different angles. Let's start by inviting Pamela Molina, the Executive Director of the World Federation of the Deaf. Pamela, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you have a super busy schedule, especially this week. So I appreciate you joining. Pamela is going to use a PowerPoint and she will speak about the sign language rights in general and what are some very important facts that some of us may not be super aware of. Pamela, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you, Elham. Thank you so much. And thank you all to everyone who is here today for making time this morning or evening, depending on where you are. This is an important event, and so I want to say thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to be discussing this topic with all of you around the rights to sign language and the rights to access. So next slide, please. Keep going. There we are. Thank you so much. So when it comes to the deaf community, what many people don't realize is that deaf people have all kinds of identities. So the deaf community is part of the disability movement with the disabled identity, but deaf people are also a linguistic and cultural group. So they have their own cultural identity, their own linguistic identity. Next slide. Which means that a lot of deaf people have intersectional identities. They have their language, and with language comes laws and constitutional rights around having access to their language as a right, but it's also a tool. And I think that's a common perspective that people have. So people might think of sign language as a communication tool. It might also be a medium as a way to get deaf people their rights, but there's also another perspective on language. Because it is the natural language to deaf people, it's not just a tool, it's their actual right to have sign language. It's their actual right to be able to communicate in sign language. It's a right to be able to decide for themselves what language they want to communicate in, typically in sign language. And next slide, please. This slide speaks to the consequences that happens when there is no access to sign language. Deaf children lose access to education. They lose access to developmental stages that they're supposed to hit. And deaf people in general lose their access to their cultural identity. Now, you might have heard the term deafhood or deafness. Deafness usually is a medical condition, and it doesn't relate to the cultural identity of being deaf, but deafhood speaks to the community that comes with being sign language users. It also addresses the way that deaf people learn differently as visual language users. They're also a visual culture, a visual people, and so they see the world differently than the rest of us do. And so what the rest of the world might do is look at deaf people and think that they're different or deficient, or their way doesn't have value. But that's not the case. Deaf people have their own ways, their own cultures, and their own languages, which is why being deaf is also an intersectional identity for many deaf people. The challenge that most deaf people face is that society at large is focused on the medical label of deafness, that hearing is broken, that something has to be fixed. And they tend to focus on the issue of hearing rather than focusing on the personhood, the cultural identity of deaf people, deafhood, which is why oftentimes deaf people are forced to assimilate to the hearing society and the hearing way of life, and not giving deaf people a chance to leverage their cultural values. And so oftentimes deaf people are having to learn how to speak instead of society meeting them in sign language. And what we see is that 90% of deaf children in the world are victims to some degree of language deprivation. Next slide. Due to, oh, sorry, yes, the autism slide is where I am. Thank you so much. Due to language deprivation that 90% of deaf children experience because society has these barriers for deaf people to access sign language, what happens is many deaf children miss that critical period of language acquisition, which is from the ages of 0 to 5. This impacts deaf children's ability to acquire any language at all. So when they don't acquire language within 0 to 5, they become actually more disabled, because the results of not acquiring language within that critical time is that it affects cognitive disabilities or cognitive development, in addition to language acquisition. So it's important that deaf children have access to sign language during those ages. And if they don't have access to sign language and they don't hear language because they're deaf, they become isolated and language deprived. So a lot of deaf children struggle with this. And typically deaf children, when able to acquire sign language, their natural language, during the critical development period of 0 to 5, they then have a foundation for language, and acquiring a second language, such as a written language that people speak and hear, such as English, for example, they can acquire much easier. They become on par with hearing children in ability to learn. The concern is that 90 to 95% of deaf children are born to hearing parents who often do not know or do not learn sign language, because a lot of them don't want to learn sign language. So those children, almost 95% of deaf children between the ages of 0 to 5, because they don't hear, they don't have access to spoken language, and then they don't have access to sign language. And that late exposure to a language negatively affects their proficiency and their development. It's also deprivation of their language and their rights. Unfortunately, this ensures that as they grow into adulthood, they will encounter more barriers. But if we give deaf people the opportunity to, and recognize their rights to acquire their natural language within 0 to 5, we can make a difference. We see that only 5% of deaf children are born from deaf parents or parents who use sign language. That gives them an opportunity to develop with language, with being able to build connections, being able to build relationships. And they oftentimes, these 5% of deaf children born to signing parents, develop on par with hearing children. So if we don't give deaf children access to sign language, they are prevented from their own human rights around language. They do not have the ability to exercise other human rights of theirs. And Beth just lost everybody, so hold on.
I'm so sorry. Some folks see Pamela and some don't.
Yeah, I think maybe if people just choose the speaker view, then they should be okay. And maybe we can leave it as this from now on, because Chris here, I need to be able to see everyone the way I've set it up. And I think people maybe just need to choose speaker view. And so without sign language, ultimately, there is no access to any human rights. And now we're ready for the next slide. Thank you. So if you can see the statistic here, I'll read it either way. It's significant. Only 2% of the world's deaf population has access to sign language for education. 2%. UNESCO says there is the right to be educated in our natural language. For most deaf children in the world, that is sign language, because they do not hear, and spoken languages do not come to them naturally the way that sign language do for deaf people. Because sign language is a visual language, deaf people are visual people, and so access to sign language is their right. We agree that everyone has the right to be educated in their natural language. So for deaf people, we need to provide sign language in education. However, that's not what's happening. What we see is that many deaf children are being forced to learn other ways to communicate and are being deprived of their right to be educated in sign language. Next slide. Now, I've said the term language deprivation, but I'd like to speak a little bit more about the impacts of language deprivation. So when there is severe language deprivation in deaf adults, there are several consequences. One is that there's delayed cognitive and language development. Because deaf children didn't acquire language within that critical window of language acquisition, it actually impacts their ability to learn anything else. It impacts their ability to achieve their full human development, which means they're not as included in society. They do not have equal quality access to information, which means that they're at risk and they're not able to contribute fully to society and enjoy being a full member of society. Oftentimes, deaf people who are language deprived, because they don't have language to express themselves, aren't unable to fully express themselves, then they can't respond to what they're seeing in society and their deprivations of their rights because they have the language delay in being able to convey their thoughts and feelings. So that means they struggle with their emotional well-being. They can't express thoughts and process what is happening around them through language. So they don't react in situations of emergency the same way hearing people do, or other people who have disabilities that are not deaf. And that means their ability to plan or see a future is impaired. And that means they can't make decisions the way they would normally, and they do not achieve autonomy the way everyone else has the right to. Next slide. Next slide. Perfect. So this slide is important for me to acknowledge that sign language is not universal. I really want to make that point clear. Every country has their own sign language. These are national. These are dependent on the community and culture that exists in the place where the language emerges. The deaf community is not a monolith. The deaf community is reflective of their country's culture. And so that's why as many spoken languages as there is as many sign languages. Because of the fact that sign language is representative of people's culture, closed caption, not being a language, does not replace the need for sign language. Captions actually only provide access to maybe what is being spoken, but it is unidirectional. It's not bidirectional. It doesn't allow deaf people to say what they're thinking. And so that's why I asked to go to the next slide, please.
Camila, it's me. I'm requesting please to
Yep.
wrap up.
So because oftentimes the technology that exists is just a one-way translation or remote translation, it means that deaf people might have access to information, but they're not able to convey their own responses, thoughts, and expressions back. And that's one of the challenges. And so because you just said, because of time, I'll hurry up. Next slide, please. So now in conclusion, for my presentation today, I've shared some different examples, but we've had opportunities to work in Ukraine, Poland, Palestine, different areas where there is conflict. And we were able to work with the deaf community. You can see listed here, and I'll ask you to go to the next slide because of time. So I'll conclude with my recommendations for public policies. So the right to access sign language does not only mean that certified neutral professional interpreters will be enough. We also need them to have ethical training. First responders need to be familiar, resettlement agencies need to be familiar, and they need to be able to provide interpreters in all those contexts. It also implies partnering with local deaf-led organizations, so that way we can meet the needs of deaf refugees and also ensure that we're providing appropriate access to information that they need to know in their sign language. So this implies massifying the national sign language learning throughout the community, starting with the family. And so when the family knows the national sign language, the deaf person has more of a support system, and then that ripple effect can lead out to the entire community and hopefully country. It also implies generating concordant linguistic and cultural environments. This means that language, visuality, spatiality are considered and implemented in any of the early warning systems and any of the alert systems in the first response to a crisis, also for the displacement and resettlement, and lastly, the incorporation of deaf signing people in their own decision-making processes. We need to have nothing about us without us.
Great.
I have two more points, Elham, and I'll just say these and then I really am done. But what I will say is that it is necessary to extend the full legal recognition of sign languages, because this is an obligation undertaken by 193 member countries of the UN, which means that they are and we are responsible to ensure that this recognition encompasses the individual and collective dimensions of the rights of deaf people, but we only have 73 countries recognizing them so far at different levels. So that means including that they recognize them maybe as a means of communication in sign language and will incorporate it as such, but they don't necessarily recognize deaf people's rights to language and sign language. And that's all I have for everyone. Thank you for your time and your attention. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Pamela. It was such a great presentation, and you included so many important points that I really don't know which one to highlight, but maybe what stood to me is, first of all, this labeling of deafness as a medical issue, which has been at the core of all disability movement that do not look at disability, at deafness as like a medical issue, but look into it as a social construct. And I really hope that we can have more of this conversation in the future, and like listening to you about how 90% of deaf children do not have access to sign language and do not learn sign language on time, and have face language deprivation, like makes me think about how is the situation among deaf children who are refugees, you know? So for them, that's should be even more than that 90%. All right, so thank you so much for setting the scene so beautifully and informatively. Now we're gonna turn on to Caroline Atin, who is the director of South Sudan Women with Disabilities Network. Caroline actually has been one of the 3 people with disabilities and the only deaf person who briefed the United Nations Security Council. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pretty evening for you. I want to ask you to tell us, based on your experience advocating for rights of deaf refugees and deaf people with disabilities, and including women, what are the main challenges that deaf refugees face during the displacement when they want to move, and especially with adopting some sort of intersectional approach that has been always your way of addressing issues? Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As my name has been mentioned and what I do, I wouldn't love to repeat again due to time constraints. And for myself, I've really experienced the challenges that deaf people experience especially during conflicts. It is true, I see it, and I feel so bad. I feel so bad. I feel so sad because very many deaf refugees miss out on the opportunities and also do not have the rights, especially in Africa. In Africa, the deaf refugees are really very many that have so many challenges and are not given opportunities to education. They have no opportunities. They are limited from several opportunities. Putting that aside, my personal experience, I also got a personal experience. I wasn't born deaf. I was born hearing, but then during war, during the shootings, that's when I got to be deafened at the age of 5. And this made my experience more traumatic. And the situation was so challenging and went through a lot of struggles due to communication barriers. My parents tried their level best. They struggled so many times. They thought that they would take me to operate my hearing ability in Kenya, but they were advised not to operate me. And they were advised of the opportunities I would get to access education in Uganda. But my parents were so inspirational in that they had to take me to a deaf school. And that's when I realized that I wasn't alone and I was able to learn sign language. And also the school helped me so much. That is how I was able to acquire language. But also another challenge that I experienced when I reached the border, I had the experience a very big challenge with some deaf colleagues that I had, and also immigration. There were many challenges and a very bad experience. We were deaf refugees, a group of deaf refugees from South Sudan. We were staying in Uganda. We wanted to go to South Sudan after they signed the CPA. After the CPA was signed, the agreement was signed, and so we thought about it and said, why not go back to South Sudan? Because we also wanted to advocate on the issues of the deaf children, access to education, and very many other issues. As we reached the border, wow, it was a very tough experience. We faced challenges at the border and also at the immigration offices. They could not believe that we're deaf refugees. They wouldn't believe. They were saying, no, there is no way you can be deaf. How comes you can communicate? How comes you know how to write? They forced us to speak. But we wouldn't speak. And they also forced us with the guns. They told us, if you don't speak, we are going to shoot you. You have to speak. And this was so threatening. It scared us. And also other people were looking at us. We're 5 deaf people and refugees. They talked to the army and said, these ones are deaf people. They use sign language and they cannot speak. But the immigration officers and the army guys were like, no, this is impossible. These guys are pretending. They can use sign language. They have to speak. The army insisted, and so he had to start with lead, and then he started pushing them. So the rest of my colleagues started fearing due to the gun threat. But for me personally, Team Caroline, I never had that fear. I never felt threatened with the army. I had to face them, and I told them that you are army, you are the law keepers, but then you are breaking us. It's like you are abusing our right. We have a right to sign language. We are not hearing people. I tried to give them even experience I had. I remember very well. It was the worst experience I had. Because they really pushed us so hard in that they wanted us to speak, and then they took us to the prison in Yei. So we had the worst challenge in Yei. We would stay hungry without anything to eat, and many army people would come and they come and surround us and tell us, you people are pretending. We told the army, how would we pretend? But other deaf colleagues, the four of them were crying, they were threatened, they were in worries, but I kept my faith strong and I wouldn't fear the army. I told them would write and exchange notes. After something like 2 weeks, the army understood that it was true, we were deaf. And then they freed us. But before they nearly killed us. But after that, they saw that it was true, and we stood on our word. So they after that they tried to call our families. They coordinated, and my uncle came and told them, "This is my daughter. She's deaf." And also the other colleagues had to pick up people that were supposed to stand as their witness, and that is how we got freed. But that was a very traumatizing experience. After that, my uncle thought that we were at risk. It shouldn't be good for us to go back to Sudan, so we had to come back to Uganda for safety. And then the second time, I tried to go back to Juba. It was a similar experience with the army and the police. But after, I had to think that I think I cannot explain more because of time about my experiences. To sum up with this, when I got to Juba, I faced a lot. I had to face a lot. The army and the police had to beat me. They had to torture me. That was in 2017. From that time, it made me very angry, and I informed the government, please, government must write in the constitution. They must indicate a law that shows that deaf rights, human rights, that sign language is a human right to the deaf. This should be in the constitution. So I had to try and call many people. But the good thing is that I had to use my family members, because my family members helped me out, because they were also part of the advocacy team to government. So we called for a conference in the parliament. They called for a hearing in the parliament. That was in 2017, in the month of July. So we convened and advocated for sign language. This was a very big barrier for the deaf people. Lack of awareness about sign language was a very big barrier. And so the parliament approved that and put it in the constitution. That was 2007 was when we advocated, and 2011, the law was approved. So we had the sign language into the constitution. In South Sudan, I think South Sudan, it's the Constitution of South Sudan, Article 6, it says that deaf people have the right to sign language and the freedom to enjoy sign language. But before, it was a very big barrier, and we never had it in the constitution. Secondly, during traveling or travels, there are very many challenges that are faced. Also, deaf refugees in Uganda. We have very many deaf refugees in Uganda. There are very many deaf refugees in Kenya, and very many share similar experiences and challenges. For example, opportunities are given to the hearing people, for instance, to go and fly for studies. Scholarships are given to the hearing people to go out and study, and more other opportunities. But for the deaf people, always left out. Because I remember in 2013, I tried my level best to advocate to the UN, and advocated in many organizations, and asked them, why is it that deaf people are left behind? Other hearing people are given opportunities to fly, opportunities to scholarships, and then UN had to accept. And so now some deaf refugees are being given opportunities to scholarships in Canada, in America, and many other places. But one thing that is really so challenging here in Uganda for the deaf refugees, for example, from my experience, I've had the worst experience when I go to UNHCR. The interview. Deaf people have very many challenges on the interview, because UN has power to appoint their own sign language interpreter during interview, but that is not accepted. Remember, each deaf refugees. They come from different countries: Burundi, Congo, Rwanda, very many different countries, and so they do not know the Ugandan sign language, but UN decides on their behalf and decides to appoint a sign language interpreter for them. Very many deaf refugees have really faced this challenge, and they say we do not get the communication. It's because each country usually has their own sign language, and also sometimes the deaf people have their own people that they understand best. That's why very many deaf refugees have usually failed interviews due to this communication challenge. And secondly, another challenge about sign language, for example, when a deaf person wants an interpreter, UN says that you as a refugee, a deaf refugee, you're responsible to cater for the payments of your sign language interpreter. And this has been a very big barrier to very many deaf people, because some of them do not work, they are not employed, and UNHCR really need to look into this and see how they can change this system and honor and respect the rights and of the deaf people. So to sum this up, I think I would sum my speech up because of time, but we shall keep sharing more with time. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline, for sharing with us your experience and your story. That was such a heartbreaking story. And I hear that you also mentioning the fact that, something that also Pamela concluded her presentation with, that like not all deaf people speak the same sign language. They are not a homogeneous group. They are speaking as many as spoken languages that we have. We have as many sign languages. And this is a very simple fact, but sounds like everywhere it's still being challenging to get the sign language interpretation that people need. Thank you very much, Caroline. It's never enough to hear from you. You always have something more to share. So we hope to get back to you as well during the questions. Now we come back here in the United States, and we go to Rochester, New York. I request colleagues to prepare Diana's presentation. We're going to hear from Diana Prince. Diana Prince is the co-founder and executive director of Deaf Refugee Advocacy, which is a very interesting initiative providing support to deaf refugees in Rochester, New York. And Rochester, we're going to hear from Diana about it, but has a big deaf population, among them a lot of deaf refugees. And Diana has taken the initiative to provide support for those deaf refugees. So Diana, tell us about the challenges that deaf people who are refugees face in the United States, and what your organization has done and is currently doing to support with that. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Elham. I appreciate the opportunity to present today. And as you heard Elham mention, that's right, my name is Diana Prince. And I know what you're thinking. I have to say it is true. I'm a wonderful woman, or at least I'm going to be today as I present for you, but no. I am the director of this organization, and I used to actually be a professor. I taught at Rochester Institute of Technology. And now we can go to the next slide. So my plan for my presentation is to answer Elham's questions that she posed. I'll also share what the deaf refugee experience is like in the US, especially when compared to hearing refugees' experiences in the United States. I'll also share some statistics because I know we want to know our numbers. Then I will speak to my organization and what specifically we do at Deaf Refugee Advocacy Services. And then I will share some recommended best practices for you all to take with you. And then I'll make a final note. Next slide, please. So I'm sure you're wondering just how many deaf people there are out there. Well, according to the World World Health Organization, worldwide, there are 15% of people who have a disability. Now, that doesn't mean that 15% of the world is deaf or hard of hearing. It's just that 15% of the world's population has a disability. Now, in the United States, typically, we have about 10% of deaf people from the total population. And if we apply that to the refugee math, if 10% of the refugees are also deaf that are in the US, that means there's 138,480 deaf refugees in the US. Next slide, please. Now, when we have refugees arriving in the US, obviously everyone has their own experience. But life is not always what's promised to be here in the US, I'm sorry to say, and I think that a lot of the refugees discover that upon arrival. So for deaf refugees, most of the time, we find that they've come to the US with little to no access to education, language learning, or job training. Of course, those resources are available to hearing refugees, but not to deaf refugees. But because of that, it ensures that their isolation continues. So most deaf people know what it's like to not be able to communicate amongst their hearing family members. So that's already isolation that they experience. And then maybe they live in an area where there are no other deaf people, and then their isolation continues as well. And then they are here in the US. So here in the US, we do provide financial support if a deaf person can't find work. But when a refugee comes to the US and they're deaf, we're able to provide funding for the first 7 years. However, if the deaf refugee does not become a citizenship within 7 years, the funding stops. And that has serious impact on them because they don't have financial support to live in the US as refugees. Next slide, please. So now I'll speak to our organization, Deaf Refugee Advocacy. We are a deaf-centric organization, which means that all of us who work here, who are on the board, are deaf or deaf-centric. Now, in 2017, our organization, I'll refer to it as DRA, was founded on a volunteer basis. And initially, our goal was to be able to provide ASL classes to refugees. But then we found out that not everyone who came to the US had equal experiences around education, language learning, employment, and access to citizenship, which meant just teaching ASL classes was not going to meet the needs of the deaf refugee community. We saw that a lot of the deaf refugees experience barriers, whether that's around language access, different educational programs. A lot of them had language deprivation themselves. And so it meant that these individuals did not necessarily have the full self-realization to navigate the experience of being a refugee in the US. Also, cultural shock between the US and their home country's culture. Also, there are a lot of refugee organizations that are dedicated to helping this population, but a lot of them did not know what to do with deaf refugees. And so that's what our work looked like until 2023, which is the year that we were able to become a full agency organization and pay our staff, so no longer on a volunteer basis. And next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So the services that we provide at DRA, we kind of focused them in 3 different areas. So one is education, one is case management, and the last is outreach. So that means educational training as well. For the greater category of education, our program was specifically developed and designed with deaf refugees in mind. So this means that we wanted to be able to successfully educate a group of people who had a range of backgrounds and a range of degree of language deprivation. So we had a specialized curriculum that would cover all subjects. We also had educational tools that would help support their mental and also their behavioral health in making this transition to the US. We also ensured that the space that we've created for the deaf refugees feels like a safe learning environment, meaning we also recognize deaf culture, which was very important for our refugees. And we also believed that it was important to provide navigational tools as deaf role models ourselves, so that way these refugees could see deaf people in leadership. And that would be vital for them to learn how to navigate in a world that focuses on oral or written communication like we are here in the US. So we have classes, and we also provide individual training and tutorship on a variety of topics. Maybe that's financial literacy, citizenship, ASL, English, driving classes, computer classes. So we have classes every day. Next slide, please. Now, the second area that we focus on here at DRA Services is casework management and advocacy approach. So our approach is tailored to deaf individuals who experience language deprivation. So we know that these are refugees who might not have had access to language, and so we provide direct services along with referral services. And so we utilize all kinds of processes for them when they arrive, all the way to citizenship. And so sometimes this becomes standard case management support services for refugees, like finding housing, food, stamps, and other government services that they might need assistance in navigating. And next slide, please. And the third focus of our services is outreach and training, which is basically what I'm doing today. I am speaking to what our organization does to a variety of people, but it also helps us provide expert testimony in the court system. And we also provide consultations to a variety of local and national groups to understand what the experience is like for people who are deaf and also refugees, because the court systems don't always understand that, nor do various local and national groups. So we provide assistance there. Next slide, please. So with those three services, we have made some impact, and I'd like to share some real world examples, because we have been able to make a difference in deaf refugees' lives here in Rochester. Some real world examples, like I said, I would share is when we find that there are deaf women who come to the US, they're pregnant, they might have language access, but they don't feel well, they need to go to the doctor. But even with the interpreter in the room, we find that there are still misunderstandings. We had one instance where the doctor thought this woman was saying that she has cancer. And so I'm sure you can guess what happened next. The deaf refugee woman said, well, can you get rid of the cancer? But because of the interpreting process and language misunderstanding, the doctor received the message as, can I have an abortion? And then through that clarification process, the deaf refugee realized, oh, okay, I'm pregnant, I don't have cancer, great. But the deaf doctor didn't trust that she had arrived to understanding, and so CPS was called in, Child Protective Services. Now, when DRA was formed, we were able to help with her second pregnancy because she was nervous when she got pregnant again. We ensured that we would go to all of her appointments with her to ensure that there were no misunderstandings. And I'm happy to say that our second baby was born healthy and easy. Another real world example has to do with parental rights. Now, before DRA was founded, there was a deaf woman who had a baby, wanted to go to the doctor and get the checkup for the baby. And she was waiting for her appointment, and she put the baby on the chair just so she could quickly go to the bathroom. And by the time she came back to her baby, who she'd left in the chair, CPS, Child Protective Services, had already been called, and she lost parental rights to her baby. Now, after DRA was founded, we had another family who we worked with who had allowed their son, who was 4, to bike up and down the street. Now, there wasn't a parent outside supervising this child biking, and so CPS was called. Fortunately, DRA had been founded at this point, and we were able to intervene and provide services to that family, and they were able to keep their parental rights. So these are 2 examples of the impact that we've made. And next slide, please. Now I will share some recommended best practices, and Pamela shared recommendations to this effect as well in her presentation. So I'm in a way amplifying those. Now, for refugee resettlement organizations, it's important to place families in cities that have deaf-centric support systems, so that way they can have more, at least, equitable opportunities to education and to case management support and language. Next slide.
Diana, I'm really sorry, but your time is over.
Sure, I will just wrap up these 2 slides very quickly.
Sure.
Case management, it's very important that there is language access planning involved in that process, especially when it comes to deaf refugees. So this isn't around spoken language access, but sign language access. My second point is that case managers must be working with deaf organizations for a deaf refugee, because that way it enhances equality. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure if I was to say something. So then with that partnership, the aim is that we can create development around a national resource center. That way we can train and share resources with different refugee settlement organizations around how to support their deaf refugees, partnering with deaf organizations that provide services. So you can always reach out to us. Next slide. And then actually, Elham, I'm sorry, I can't stop without discussing financial support. We all need money. And so I just want to say that any money that is channeled into organizations that have expertise like us, DRA, can help address the needs and train others, but also I encourage you to create line items in your budget, preparing for partnerships with deaf organizations or to deaf populations, right? You can't work with deaf populations without having deaf expertise. And so have that line item ready to work with an organization who can help you do your work. And then next slide is my last slide. And so I can leave it there once you go to it, of course. As Helen Keller said, alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. So DRA really looks forward to working together and really work on the betterment of everyone, because what impacts one group affects everyone. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, we can do a lot together, and that's why we are here. Thank you so much, Diana, for your powerful contribution. I mean, I have been moderating so many events, but it has never been so hard to give people time warning and ask them to wrap up because I'm really enjoying this conversation and learning about what deaf refugee advocacy does. I hope that these events where you come and share your experience, what you're doing, would open a lot of new doors for you and your organization and for many other people who work to advance rights of refugees with disabilities, including deaf refugees. All right, so let's get a little bit more legal. Law is one of the powerful tools that we have to advance rights and inclusion of refugees, including refugees with disabilities. We have with us Professor Gerard Quinn. Gerard Quinn is a legendary in the world of disability rights. He has been one of the founders and writers of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and has been teaching in National University of Ireland, Galway. I have learned a lot from Gerard. I'm sure many people in disability movement are sharing this experience with me. Gerard, thank you so much for joining us. My question to you is to tell us about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. What does that offer in terms of states' obligations to ensure access to sign language for deaf refugees? Basically, about what we heard from Pamela, what we heard from Caroline, what we heard from Diana, and much more than that. We know that the CRPD convention has grown a lot. We also know that we have the existing body of law, refugee law codified in 1951 Refugee Law Convention. But are these two super important bodies of law really work together? Have the possibility of complementary nature between the two really been, this potential have been realized, or what we should do to address that? I mean, it's a lot for 10 minutes, but I ask you to wrap up in 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Elham, and congratulations to you and your co-organizers on a really, really wonderful seminar. So you've put to me two basic questions. First of all, how does the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities advance the rights of the deaf or the hard of hearing? And secondly, in what way do the core treaties in question, the Refugee Convention of 1951 and the UN Convention Disability Convention of 2006, in what ways do they overlap and intersect to reinforce one another? So on the first question first, our basic idea when drafting the UN Disability Treaty was not to create new rights, but to tailor existing human rights to make them real for persons with disabilities. In a way, we were trying to make visible the many barriers and blockages experienced by people with disabilities in exercising rights that were simply taken for granted by others. And that meant taking general rights like freedom of expression, identifying the many blockages experienced by people with disabilities, and then to reverse engineer the obligations of states to overcome these obstacles. Because of some very interesting procedural innovations, the drafting of the UN Disability Treaty was one of the most inclusive drafting processes so far in the UN system. We were very blessed to have the World Federation of the Deaf, and especially Lisa Kauppanen and Marco Jokinen, play a highly active part in the drafting of the treaty. So the question that logically and naturally arose was, what are the specific blockages faced by persons who are hard of hearing or deaf, and how can they be dissolved through state action and legal obligations to that effect? A primary blockage to the enjoyment of all human rights and inclusion for the deaf and hard of hearing was the communications barrier and recognition of their language and cultural identity. Sign language at that point in time in the early 2000s had legal status really in only a handful of countries in the world. And this just served to further marginalize this community. A hint that this was to change came in the definition of languages in the recital section of the treaty, which stated that language included sign language. And a distinguishing feature of the UN CRPD is Article 9 on accessibility. Subsection 2E of Article 9 requires states to take appropriate measures to provide live intermediaries, including professional sign language interpreters. This is augmented by Article 21 on freedom of expression, which requires states to take all appropriate measures to provide and facilitate the use of sign language. And Article 21 also requires states to recognize and promote the use of sign language. Together, these provisions serve to mandate the legal recognition of sign language and therefore its use in interacting, particularly with the state. I would say it goes beyond that to require states to ensure that sign language can be used in broader everyday transactions, a language and not just a means of communication. The right to education provision, Article 24, also embraces sign language in several different important ways. Article 24(3)(c) affords a right to children who are deaf or deaf-blind to ensure that their education is given in the most appropriate environment, one that maximizes social and academic development. This is widely to interpret to mean that the linguistic needs of deaf children requires intensive preparation to prime them for a life of inclusion. And very importantly, these distinct needs lead to a recognition of the distinctive linguistic, and I would also say with Pamela, cultural identity of the deaf. So all of these provisions add up to a very strong mandate to enable and facilitate the use of sign language, especially but not exclusively in interaction with the state. And this obviously includes the international protection system in as much as states are in the driving seat. By the way, only states ratify the UN CRPD. However, the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy of 2019 requires all UN agencies, and that certainly includes the UN Refugee High Commission as well as other UN humanitarian bodies, to mainstream disability rights. As to your second question, and I'll be very brief, how do the two treaties interact? A few basic points. A basic point is that the Refugee Convention is all about protection. Protection is not a bad word, since there are many provisions in the UN Disability Treaty that also aim to protect. But of course, the UN CRPD aims at much broader theory and practice of inclusion. And I think that's what Diana was really getting at in her presentation. So the question is, how can the value of inclusion in the UN Disability Treaty enrich and inform the practice of protection under the Refugee Convention? I think there are three potential points of possible intersection between the two treaties. First of all, is the issue of qualification for international protection. The main criterion is a well-founded fear of persecution, and that may interact with one's status as a person with a disability. Let's say there's a pattern of exclusion and marginalization of deaf people in a certain country. Then to what extent does this pattern amount to proof of a well-founded fear? This may be easier to answer where, for example, it's the right to life that's at stake for persons with albinism in certain countries, but it's certainly not beyond the bounds to argue that the marginalization and exclusion of persons who are deaf or hard of hearing can also count. For example, what if the linguistic and cultural identity of the deaf is completely ignored or denied? Can they, on that count, claim a well-founded fear of persecution? Secondly, there's the question of decision-making on one's status. How open or how inclusive is it to persons who are deaf or hard of hearing? If sign language is not provided, then of course it's much harder, I would say probably impossible, to hear the authentic voice of the person. It's obvious that any decision that results from such a process lacks legitimacy. That's why procedural accommodations, for which the UN Disability Treaty is rightly famous, are needed not just to secure justice for the individual, but to actually legitimate the process. And thirdly, there are reception issues. And I think this is quite important, either in the short term, whilst seeking international protection, or in the long term, when acknowledged as having refugee status. And I think Diane was getting at many of these issues. The main question is just how inclusive are these reception conditions And will the individual be enabled to take up a productive life in his or her new environment? A lot will turn on how inclusive the receiving country is to its own citizens with disabilities, and not just those seeking international protection. Here, I think the UN Disability Treaty goes well beyond the narrow remit of protection under the Refugee Convention of 1951. We have barely scratched the surface on these issues. And Ilham, you asked me, where are we at in terms of the interaction of the two treaties? And I will stop here. In conclusion, I would say the UN Disability Treaty ideally works to make the conception of protection under the Refugee Convention much more inclusive. And it potentially works to ensure that once established in one's country of adoption, then a much broader and deeper agenda of inclusion should be adopted to make space for human flourishing and in a way that's inclusive. I would say we're right at the beginning of this creative interaction of these two very different treaty regimes. The international protection system has yet to become truly inclusive of persons who are deaf or hard of hearing. And in a way, the process of making the international protection system more inclusive is what will make the Refugee Convention of 1951 fit for purpose in the 21st century. Thank you so much, Ellen.
Thank you so much, Gerald. So we barely scratched the face. That's just like motivating and like a good picture of the reality of where we are. But I mean, I feel very positive that we have a lot to do, but we have a lot of tools that we need for that, including colleagues here on this panel, our audience, and all the great bodies of law at play. So the only thing we need to do, which is not easy, but it's super important, is to use these tools, mobilize these tools that we have, and start going more than the surface. Thank you so much, Gerald, for that. Sharing a lot of ideas already for food for thought and action. All right, so now we are going to turn to Alison Ecker. Alison is an immigration attorney in the US who is also deaf, and it was my pleasure to meet her very recently. Alison has done a lot of work in immigration law, and as a deaf person, she's of course super interested to identify and address barriers that deaf people face navigating US immigration system. So Alison, time is running short. I figure we don't have a lot of time remain for questions and answer, but I want you to tell us what you have identified so far about those barriers in US immigration system, and what you think are the potentials of the US system to address those. What are next steps in your opinion? Over to you.
Thank you for having me here, Ilham. It's a pleasure to be here with you all for this important event. So to answer your question, well, first of all, let me just give a little bit of background on myself. I know we have not a whole lot of time, so I'll try to keep it really brief. So I was born deaf. I identify as deaf with a little d because I'm not fluent in ASL. Unfortunately, I'm working on it though. And I am currently a solo practitioner specializing only in immigration law. And I work mostly with clients from Latin American countries whose first language is typically Spanish, although I've also worked with clients who are indigenous and speak other dialects, and Spanish is not their first language. So that's a little bit of the main clients that I work with, and sort of the cultural background and that I most frequently see. So to kind of, I wanted to sort of zoom out a bit and talk about the legal infrastructure of the immigration framework within the US, because as I'm sure you're all aware, immigration law is federal. So I'll mostly be talking about this in the context of the federal courts and not the state courts, because it's completely separate. So some of the issues that I see in the immigration court is how variable it is from state to state. So even though immigration law should be applied consistently because it's federal, it should be applied consistently from state to state. The way each court handles their caseloads is very different, and the access that they provide is very different. One of the main barriers is that the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is sort of the main enforcement tool for disability rights within the US, does not apply to the federal courts. And I didn't find that out actually until after I graduated law school and started practicing law, and that was a big shock to me. So what might you ask can be done to enforce the protection of rights of people with disabilities in the federal courts, including immigration courts? And the answer is not a lot. And I don't say that to say where we can go from here, but currently what the reality is right now is that there is not a lot in place procedurally to force the immigration courts to provide access. And so let me talk about essentially what the courts have is something called an executive order that requires all federal agencies to provide meaningful access to people who speak other languages and are not proficient in English. And this is a very vague definition, which at a minimum requires interpreters during all hearings, trials, and motions where the client is not proficient in English, and at a minimum, again, interpreters who are competent in the language that they will be interpreting in. There's a very lax system for certifying court interpreters in the immigration courts, and so there's frequently interpreting errors, and this is a huge problem in the immigration courts. And I have personally witnessed many times when the interpreter, they might be proficient at a conversational level or kind of in an everyday speech of the target language, but inside the immigration court, there's a lot of technical legal jargon within the world of immigration law that they might not necessarily be qualified to interpret. So again, the immigration courts really just need to provide what they call meaningful access, which is a very loose definition and not enforced very well, and it is inconsistently provided across courts and across states in the US. Let's see, then the other problem outside of the court system, and actually I should explain that not everyone who comes to the US will be inside of an immigration court. Some people will deal primarily with USCIS. So there's two different systems for processing immigration cases. And within USCIS, they'll often do interviews where an interpreter will be needed. And sometimes they'll do this by phone or video. And there can be, technology issues, with the video freezing up. I mean, we saw it today where the video will freeze and the person won't be able to see the interpreter. And that can also cause problems in communicating during the immigration proceedings. And then another thing that we've seen is obviously immigration law is very subject to the political movings of whoever is in office. And so it can kind of ebb and flow. And an example of this is in 2018, Attorney General Sessions mandated that immigration judges have a quota of cases that they needed to process. And I believe it was about, they needed to process a minimum of 700 cases per fiscal year. So the intent behind that was to sort of push judges to close out cases and get people deported. And so in a system that is already biased against immigrants to begin with, especially depending on who our elected officials are, it can be even more difficult for people who need sign language access or other language access to work with the courts to get that access and request accommodation because of this rushed system that just wants to get as many cases through as possible and is generally not interested in immigrant rights in general because of the biases that we have. And then really quickly, I just wanted to give some real life examples of the drastic consequences that this sort of lack of support and barriers can have. One is a case from here in Oregon, which is where I am. It was a farm worker from Guatemala, I believe, who his first language was not Spanish. It was an indigenous language. And he was wrongfully convicted of murder because of translation issues inside the courtroom. And unfortunately, this gentleman had to spend 5 years in prison before his conviction was overturned by the judge. And this was all because of interpreting errors in the courtroom because it was assumed that Spanish was his first language. And then another example is, again, another Guatemalan client who was a victim of the Guatemalan Civil War. He became profoundly deaf after a bomb exploded while his father was carrying him to safety as a boy. And he was not able to really communicate and became increasingly isolated after that incident. He was able to come to the US as a refugee, and he got a hearing aid before his immigration court hearing. But because he hadn't had the training or the language skills developed prior to that, he had difficulty testifying in court. So as a result of that, the immigration judge denied his case. It went on to be appealed at the next level at the BIA, who also denied it. They affirmed the immigration judge's decision, and then it was appealed again. And then finally, at that last appeal, the judge vacated the underlying decisions and remanded the case. But it was a very clear example of how much this barrier to language access impacted this gentleman's case and how much he had to go through appealing his case, not once, but twice before he was finally able to win. And then I myself in my own client work have worked with, I had a client who was also from Guatemala. He was a teenage boy. He was deaf and he had no formal instruction in either English, Spanish, or his indigenous language that he spoke. So I had difficulty communicating with him as well because he wasn't fluent in American Sign Language. And he wasn't fluent in English and he wasn't fluent in Spanish. And I had to kind of devise a creative workaround to communicate through his uncle, which, it worked out in this case, but it's not ideal because as an attorney, I need to be able to communicate directly with my client because it is my job to speak for them and to advocate for them. And I need to hear in their own words information about their case. So those are just some real life examples of, the barriers that we continue to face, whether as an attorney communicating with a client in court and communicating with the judge and having access to an adequate interpreter in the language that you communicate best in, whether that's sign language or an indigenous language. And I say this to illustrate the fact that the barriers that a lot of people who use sign language are very similar to those that speak other minority languages, such as indigenous languages from Central America. There's just not enough interpreters who are qualified to interpret in those languages. And there's not a lot of understanding in the court system about the differences in dialects and types of differences between different sign languages and how all of that can impact how someone testifies in court and the result of their court case. So
Yeah.
it's very significant.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Did someone say something?
Yeah, it was me, Elham, speaking here. Just a warning of like your time is almost over, but please feel free to wrap up.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Just wrapping up here then. So moving forward, what can we do about this? So, you know, there are several things that I would suggest, and again, this needs to happen on multiple levels. One is there needs to be education or training by, you know, deaf rights groups and other disability rights groups to attorneys in the legal community. I will say that when I went to law school, I was the only deaf student in my class, and my professors didn't know how to deal with me. You know, people, judges and other attorneys that I dealt with didn't know how to deal with me. And there was just a real lack of understanding about how to communicate with either a deaf or hard of hearing person. So there needs to be sort of greater inclusion of and training within the legal community among attorneys and judges. And then in the court system, there needs to be training as well to get more certified and qualified interpreters into the system for more minority languages such as ASL and indigenous languages and whatnot, so that people will have access to interpreters who speak their language of choice. And there needs to be training and better procedures within the court system to request accommodations. And so all of this is really just starting at a basic level of just educating people on what the needs are within the system and what access needs to be provided to people with different language needs. And then one final thought here is that a lot of states have local bar organizations that focus on different minority groups. And there's a lot of good work being done right now in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, a lot of that does not include people with disabilities. And I really think that needs to be folded into that conversation to talk about how people with disabilities, with hearing loss, deaf people are part of that diverse group. And you know, just really working to educate people that we are another minority group, and just to start those conversations around access, because those conversations are not even happening right now. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Alison. That was such a powerful and full of great examples and great recommendations. A lot for myself to note and add to my already full agenda of what I should do next. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. We hope to get the opportunity to work with you in the future and continue collaborating. Well, I mean, the conversation was so helpful and important that we barely have any time left. Thank you for those who put their questions in the Q&A section. I encourage the panelists. I see Pamela already responded to one of the questions. If you feel that you can contribute to any of the questions, please feel free to do so. I will make sure to collect the questions and address them either through the little piece like a blog post that I'm planning to publish about this event, or in future events. But rest assured that your question's gonna be answered. Also, my panelists, feel free to share your contact information in case you want people to reach out to you offline. All right, so as I started the event with, this is also somehow celebration of the commitment by the International Refugee Assistance Project, my organization, to do more to ensure disability inclusion and accessibility. And for that, I have our Executive Vice President on Program, Amy Taylor, who has been with us since the start of the event, has been watching us and been listening to us. Amy wants to share a few sentences with you and also join the Global Leaders Challenge of the World Federation of the Deaf for the 2024 International Week of Deaf People. So Amy, thank you so much for joining us. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Elham, and hello, everyone. Thank you for all the work you're doing and for everyone who spoke today. I learned a lot and just really grateful for everyone's work. I wanted to take this opportunity to celebrate the International Day of Sign Languages, as well as the International Week of Deaf People. Through this event, we just learned about incredibly powerful initiatives happening in different parts of the world, and also a lot of remaining challenges that we need to address. Our organization, the International Refugee Assistance Project, has recently started our journey toward disability inclusion and accessibility, thanks to Elham's leadership. And our aim is to ensure that people with disabilities, in particular those from underrepresented groups or marginalized groups, can equally enjoy the services and support that we provide as an organization, as a refugee serving organization, and that they can meaningfully participate in every stage of our work and their lives. I'm happy to be here today and to support Elham's leadership and to share that IRAP is fully committed to taking steps to become a fully inclusive and accessible organization, including through signing up to sign language rights for displaced refugees. We recognize that we have a long way ahead of us, but we also count on partnership with people with disabilities and deaf people and their representative organizations to achieve this goal. We also hope to be a strong advocate in all spaces and all areas of our work, calling for access to sign language for everyone. Let's work together toward a world where deaf people everywhere can sign anywhere. I also want to give deep, deep gratitude to the interpreters today. Your job is not an easy one, and it's just been incredible to watch your work. So I wanted to close by saying one short thing that I just learned today. I hope I did that correctly.
All right. I think Pamela and Diana and others, Beth, Chris, all can comment about that. But thank you so much, Amy.
No, thanks to you all, really.
No, thank you so much. All right, colleagues, by this, we are going to reach the end of our event. I want to specifically thank our sponsors, World Federation for the Deaf and CBM Global Disability Inclusion. I want to thank Elizabeth Lockwood from CBM Global, who has been huge support behind the scenes. All our speakers and panelists, the fantastic interpreters, Christopher and Beth, and Jamie, our captioner. I want to thank the IRAP's tech team, Sharuk and Sir Dimitri, who has been supporting a lot. And if I forgot anybody, please excuse me for that. Wish everyone a great rest of your day or evening, and please stay tuned, because this is just the first in the chain of events that you will have regarding different aspects of refugees with disabilities life and how to ensure their inclusion and participation. Thank you and have a great time.